Episode 9, West Virginia Lobotomy Project. Hey y'all, I'm Heather, and this is Poisoned Appalachia, the dark side of Appalachia. As always, thank you all for listening. So how did the microphone sound last time? Hopefully it was better sound for everyone. I'm still trying to figure it out. The old program I used to record wouldn't work with this microphone, so I had to use a new one. And I'm still trying to get the bugs out of it, so hopefully this time it'll sound even better. Last week was a rough episode, and this week will be a rough one too. But next week, for the month of October, I'll be doing spooky episodes. So hopefully a little more fun and a little less heavy, but still dark. We need a break after last one's and today. But today we're going to talk about the West Virginia Lobotomy Project. Probably something none of you have ever heard of. I know about it because I live across the river from where one of the state hospitals was and remember reading about it. But it's not one of those things that the state probably wants to really talk about, so it's probably something that most people don't really know about. So if you don't, if you don't know about lobotomies or want to know some more, let's cover some history of the lobotomies and then we'll go from there. A lobotomy is a type of brain surgery that involves the removal or cutting of a portion of the brain, usually for the purpose of treating a mental health condition. It was primarily used between the 1940s and 1960s. Lobotomies were sometimes safe and effective for treating psychiatric disorders, but often caused substantial adverse effects, including significant changes in personality and loss of independence. The form of psychosurgery known as lobotomy was pioneered by a Portuguese doctor, Antonio Egas Moniz, in 1936. If I pronounced that wrong, I'm sorry. I'm horrible at pronouncing things. This operation, originally known as a leucotomy, was inspired by something Dr. Moniz witnessed in the Second International Neurological Congress in London the year before. There, a Yale-based duo named Carlisle Jacobson and John Fulton related how they'd performed lobectomies on two rather aggressive chimpanzees. After their surgeries, the apes were much calmer, a fact that inspired Dr. Moniz to try the operation on human beings. His first method involved drilling holes into the skull, either from the sides or from the top, and injecting alcohol into the frontal lobes in order to cause sclerosis, a thickening and toughening of the white matter there. Side note, Jeffrey Dahmer actually did this to one of his victims, and for some reason that just really creeps me out that this doctor would do this, but I'm sure it was under different circumstances. So the doctor later began to use an instrument of his own design called a leucotome to remove 6 chunks of tissue from the frontal lobes. After having operated on 38 patients, he deemed that this prefrontal leucotomy procedure was a simple operation, always safe, and that it may prove to be an effective surgical treatment in certain diseases and causes of mental disorder. Dr. Walter Freeman, a highly, sorry, I lost my place. Dr. Walter Freeman, a highly credentialed and esteemed American doctor, had also been at that London conference. Then, hearing about Dr. Moniz's success with his leucotomy procedures, he nominated Dr. Moniz for a Nobel Prize. Dr. Moniz won it in 1947. Fascinated by Dr. Moniz's work, Dr. Freeman wanted to bring the operation to the United States. He had a problem, however. He wasn't a surgeon, and he needed one in order to open the skull as Dr. Moniz did. To his rescue came Dr. James Watts, a neurosurgeon. The two formed a partnership and began their work in earnest, beginning with a leucotomy performed on a woman named Alice Hood Hammett at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. The year was 1936, the very same year that Dr. Moniz began his work with leucotomies. Drs. Freeman and Watts modified Dr. Moniz's technique, removing even more tissue than Dr. Moniz had, and they renamed their technique lobotomy. The technique did not always produce desirable results, but there were also many successes. Patients who otherwise would spend their lives in institutions were able to get their own homes back to live in among their loved ones. Dr. Freeman would receive large stacks of Christmas cards from grateful patients and families each year. But Freeman wanted for the lobotomy to become a very streamlined process, so to be more widely available to all he felt that were in need of it, so he wouldn't feel any need to be assisted by a neurosurgeon. The technique he devised derived its nickname from the revised leucotome he'd use, the first one having been quite literally an ice pick from his kitchen. Instead of drilling into the skull to sever the connections of the frontal lobes, Dr. Freeman would insert his leucotome up over the eye of his patient, angled such that it was parallel to the bridge of the nose. He would drive it upward until it hit the orbital plate, the bone of the eye socket. At this point, he'd use a mallet to drive the instrument through the bone and almost 2 inches deep into the brain. He'd swing the leucotome 40 degrees outward toward the edge of the face, on the side that he was working on, and then bring it back almost to its original position. At this point, he'd drive it another inch or more deeply into the brain, swing it at 20 degrees towards the nose, then 30 degrees outward toward the edge of the face. He would then lift up the instrument, often breaking the orbital plate, which would leave the patients with horribly black eyes. This entire operation, done over both eyes on the orbital lobes of both hemispheres of the brain, would only take a few minutes. So basically, he scrambled people's brains, unfortunately. The first such transorbital lobotomy, as the procedure was called, was done with an ice pick. He later made his own version of a leucotome based on the ice pick's design. The instrument was called an aborticlast. The first transorbital lobotomy was performed in 1946 on a housewife named Sally Ellen Ionesco, or Ionesco. I'm not sure if it's an I or an L, but her family considered it hugely successful. So after that, Dr. Freeman was a man on a mission. Dr. Watts had learned that Dr. Freeman was performing lobotomies without the aid of the neurosurgeon, and he left him in disgust. But undeterred, Dr. Freeman brought himself a camper, which he used to drive across the United States to perform lobotomies and teach other doctors this technique. Through Freeman's promotional efforts, the procedure became widespread, and according to some estimates, 40,000 people were given lobotomies in the United States, the bulk of these in the 1940s and 1950s. The frontal lobotomy procedure had several negative effects on a patient's personality and ability to function independently. Lobotomy patients often show a reduction in initiative and inhibition. They also may exhibit difficulty imagining themselves in the position of others because of decreased cognition and detachment from society. Historically, patients of frontal lobotomies were immediately upon surgery often stuporous and incontinent. Some developed an enormous appetite and gained considerable weight. Seizures were another common complication of surgery. Emphasis was put on the training of the patients in the weeks and months following the surgery. The purpose of the operation was to reduce the symptoms of mental disorders, and it was recognized that this was accomplished by the expense of a person's personality and intellect. British psychiatrist Maurice Partridge, who conducted a follow-up on 300 patients, said that the treatment achieved its results by reducing the complexity of psychic life. Following the operation, spontaneity, responsiveness, self-awareness, and self-control were reduced. The activity was replaced by inertia, and people were mostly left emotionally blunted and restricted in their intellectual range. On average, there was a mortality rate of approximately 5% during the 1940s. Freeman's most common rationale for performing lobotomies was to treat schizophrenia, especially in patients who had just recently been diagnosed with the disease. He also used the procedure to treat chronic pain and suicidal depression. A little side note, I read that Eva Perón, who was the lady that was in charge of Argentina for a while, when she had her cervical cancer, after she died, they found that they had used a lobotomy on her to treat her pain. So in some instances, it was helpful, but a lot of instances it wasn't. A New York Times article from 1937 stated that people with the following symptoms would benefit from a lobotomy: tension, apprehension, anxiety, depression, insomnia, suicidal ideas, delusions, hallucinations, crying spells, melancholia, obsessions, panic states, disorientation, psychognesia, which is pains of psychic origin, and nervous indigestion and hysterical paralysis. So that pretty much covers most mental disorders, and I'm sure a few of us have some of these disorders, so it's a good thing that they did away with the lobotomy, or we may all be in a different state of mind right now. The consequences of the operation have been described as mixed. However, many lobotomy patients suffer devastating post-operative complications, including intracranial hemorrhage, epilepsy, alterations in affect and personality, and sorry, I lost my place again. Brain abscess, dementia, and death. Ominous portrayals of lobotomized patients in novels, plays, and films further diminished public opinion, and the development of antipsychotic medications led to a rapid decline in lobotomy's popularity and Freeman's reputation. Others could leave the hospital or become more manageable within the hospital. A precarious amount of people managed to return to responsible work, while at the other extreme, people were left with severe disabling impairments. Most people fell into an intermediate group, left with some improvement of their symptoms, but also with emotional and intellectual defects to which they made a better or worse adjustment. One of Freeman's most famous failures was Rosemary Kennedy, who had a lobotomy in the summer of 1941. Rosemary was a sister of JFK. Freeman and his partner, James Watts, at the time, performed a prefrontal lobotomy on Rosemary Kennedy, leaving an inert and unable to speak more than a few words. I read that they did this while she was actually conscious, and they had her talking and reading poems, and she was singing her favorite song, God Bless America, and then she just suddenly stopped singing. So, and then that's kind of where things went bad, unfortunately. But, after her lobotomy, she was sent to live at St. Coletta's School in Wisconsin, where she remained until her death in 2005 at the age of 86. This one makes me really, really mad because she didn't really have some sort of mental disability. She was just slower. I mean, I guess she had a mental disability. She was slower. They think it was from like a long birth process or something like that. But there was nothing really wrong with her, and it's likely that Joe Kennedy just wanted to take care of her so she didn't embarrass the family, especially with their political aspirations. They wanted to get her under control. Unfortunately, a lot of lobotomies were done to women who simply to get them under control. So, yeah, lobotomies make me a little salty. But the frontal lobotomy procedure has severe negative effects on a lot of patients' personalities and ability to function independently. Lobotomy patients often showed a marked reduction in initiative and inhibition. They may also exhibit difficulty imagining themselves in the position of others because of decreased cognition and detachment from society. So it's like they just couldn't, they lost kind of what was them, unfortunately. So, but Walter Freeman coined the term surgically induced childhood and used it constantly to refer to the results of the lobotomy. The operation left some people with an infantile personality. A period of maturation would then occur, according to Freeman, and then lead to recovery. In an unpublished memoir, he described how the personality of the patient was changed in some way in the hope of rendering him more amenable to the social pressures under which he's supposed to exist. He described one 29-year-old woman as being, following lobotomy, a smiling, lazy, and satisfactory patient with the personality of an oyster. Like, this is what the doctor said. It just makes me mad. But she couldn't remember Freeman's name and endlessly poured coffee from an empty pot. When her parents had difficulty dealing with her behavior, Freeman advised a system of rewards, ice cream, and punishment, smacks. So basically, they just treated her like a child, which I'm sure she probably acted like a child, unfortunately. Well, so that's about the lobotomy. Unfortunately, nothing is brief with me, but that's the briefest history of the lobotomy that I could give and have it all make sense, I think. So that's Dr. Freeman. Now let's go to the main story. In West Virginia, during the 1950s, the West Virginia State Board of Control, which oversaw mental health protocols at the time, launched in 1952 with Dr. Freeman the West Virginia Lobotomy Project. The project's purpose was to examine the effectiveness of lobotomy by comparing lobotomized patients with matched individuals who had not been lobotomized. Why West Virginians were targeted is not clear, but it's likely a combination of an available patient population, a sympathetic and financially burdened state government, and proximity to Freeman's home base in Washington, D.C. And prohibitions by other states also had prevented them from doing it in other states. But unfortunately, when you have a state like West Virginia, it doesn't have as much oversight as some of the other states. So, as part of the West Virginia Lobotomy Project, Freeman and the state government used lobotomies to reduce overcrowding in the asylums. They hope to be able to send those people back home into society once the lobotomies were successful. At this time, in 1952, West Virginia had 4 state mental hospitals: Huntington, Spencer, Lakin, and Weston. I also read something about a Barboursville hospital, but there's very little about it, so I don't really know if it was very big, or like I said, really anything about it. So those were the 4 major ones. So let me cover the major ones quickly here, or I'll try to do it quickly. Lakin, which is the one nearest to me, is right across the Ohio River in Point Pleasant, or above Point Pleasant. Oddly enough, it's about 3 miles or less from where the Mothman was seen, but he has no part in the story. The Lakin State Hospital was built in 1926 in Point Pleasant and served as the African American mental hospital for the state during the era of segregation. Some of the terms in this are not politically correct, but I'm just reading them from what people had quoted, so please forgive me if it sounds insensitive. It's just unfortunately the language at the time. The hospital was part of a series of community services and institutions proposed by African American delegates in West Virginia's legislature. West Virginia's political makeup looked different in the 1920s. The Republican Party ran on a platform of progress and moral reform, spearheading the successful implementation of Prohibition in 1916 and the ratification of the 19th Amendment. These African American delegates, T.J. Nutter, Harry Capehart, and T.J. Coleman, saw accessible and state-funded mental health services for African American West Virginians as is essential and in tow with the Republican Party's platform. Lakin, for many years, provided mental health services to adults and children. Its facilities included brick dormitories for adult patients, a center for emotionally disturbed children, and a rehabilitation center that provided training for other services. Lakin State Hospital was West Virginia State's hospital for the African American mental health patients, then called the Colored Insane, and was completely staffed by African Americans. These demographics were very atypical for mental hospitals, which normally employed at least one white physician. In addition to all the African American staff, specialists would often visit the hospital. One of these specialists, of course, was Dr. Walter Freeman. Freeman performed over 150 lobotomies at Lakin between 1940 and 1960. The hospital shared its campus with the West Virginia Industrial School for Colored Boys, and eventually the site became the Lakin Correctional Facility, a women's prison, which is still there today. But most of the hospital doesn't exist anymore. Only the administrative building remains standing. And they completely built a new prison there for women. And of course it's women of all colors, since we're not in the era of segregation anymore. Next is Huntington State Hospital. Today that's known as the Mildred Mitchell Bateman Hospital, and was established by the legislature as a mental health facility in 1897. And it was called Home for the Incurables. At the time of its inception, such hospitals were reviewed as places where people with mental illnesses could be removed from society and given custodial care. A tall wire fence and iron gates gave the facility in Huntington the appearance of a penal institution rather than a hospital. The gates were taken away in 1950, and the gatehouse at the hospital entrance was removed in 1961. The site consisted of 30 acres of land, which was donated to the state by the Huntington Chamber of Commerce. Located on the eastern edge of the city, the hospital fronts on Norway Avenue. In 1901, the name was changed to the West Virginia Asylum, and the patient census was 150. The peak patient population was about 1,460 in 1956. In 1916, the name was changed to the Huntington State Hospital. In July 1958, a vocational rehabilitation center was established, the first in the nation to be located on the same grounds as the hospital. The center offered vocational, social, psychological, medical, and related services necessary to enable the patient to prepare for a return to the community living. And in 1995, the legislature changed the facility's name from Huntington Hospital to Mildred Mitchell Bateman Hospital. That was a tribute to Dr. Mildred Mitchell Bateman, whose lifetime career of helping people with mental illnesses. She actually worked at Lakin Hospital. She was an African-American woman. And she eventually went to the Huntington Hospital, ran it there, and then, of course, they named it after her. The 110-bed psychiatric hospital is administered by the Department of Health and Human Resources. 12 buildings are located on the site. It also provides on-learning experiences for physicians, nurses, practical nurses, psychologists, counselors, healthcare administrators, technicians, and supportive services personnel. Spencer State Hospital, authorized by the legislature in 1887, was to relieve overcrowding at Weston State Hospital. Spencer State Hospital was opened July 18th, 1893. Its connected brick buildings, a quarter of a mile in length, were sometimes referred to as the longest continuous brick building in America. It was situated west of US 33, and it was on 184 acres, donated to the state by Roane County. Spencer State Hospital remained in operation until July 1989. Spencer's original charter was to care for people with mental illnesses, although its mission broadened at times to include diseases such as typhoid fever, tuberculosis, and pneumonia. Dr. James Freeman performed the lobotomies on patients at the hospital during the 50s, which he did all of them. It is known that this surgery did not actually cure a patient, but instead would turn them into apathetic zombies, Dr. Thomas Knapp said. He was a superintendent at the hospital during Freeman's visits and did not like him at all. He recalled that Freeman once forgot the surgical hammer needed in operation and used a wooden mallet found in the kitchen. Spencer Hospital's farms were used for dairy herd, hogs, chickens, vegetable gardens, and woodlands, providing food for the patients and staff. The hospital also had its own water and power supplies. An additional 295 acres of west of the facility were used for patient recreation, and the hospital's dams watershed. The institution maintained an open-door policy with hospital grounds, with patients free to come and go, but a fence was erected from, of course, around the hospital to separate patients from the town. Between 1973 and 1976, the administrative building was torn down and replaced. In October 1993, the city of Spencer held an auction to dispose of most of the equipment left behind when the hospital closed. A local employer, Monarch Rubber Company, later Armacell, agreed to take possession of the state hospital whistle so that residents can continue hearing its regular blasts morning, noon, and night. The old hospital grounds have been torn down since, and Walmart now exists in the old hospital grounds. Of course. Walmart's everywhere, isn't it? And then there's Weston State Hospital. The Weston State Hospital is also known as the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. It was constructed in the late 1800s and designated a National Historic Landmark in 1990. It is the largest hand-cut stone masonry building in North America and is purportedly the second largest in the world next to the Kremlin. The original hospital was designed to house 250 people in 1864 and reached its peak in the 1950s with 2,400 patients. So that's like ridiculous amount there. So I can see why they all wanted to do the lobotomy project. I mean, I think honestly they thought maybe they could clear out the asylums and get people home, but it's still, I don't know. it just wasn't worth it. But the original hospital was open to patients in 1964, reached its peak in the 1950s, and by 1868, 200 patients were being cared for by the hospital. The legislature voted $110,000 in 1870 for additional buildings, and separate rooms for black patients were added in 1873. The hospital had its own farm, dairy, waterworks, and cemetery. Ultimately, it grew to house about 1,200 patients. In 1913, the state West Virginia legislature changed the name of the hospital to the Weston State Hospital. On October 3rd, 1935, a patient started a fire in the main building that destroyed 6 men's wards and caused a couple to fall through the roof. Governor Herman Guy Kump, that's hard to say, K-U-M-P, Kump, attended the Forest Festival, and Elkins rushed to the scene. The building was repaired and the hospital remained in service for the next 60 years. From 1952 to 1955, numerous patients were lobotomized there. In 1978, the main building was listed on the National Historic Register of Historic Places, and in 1990, it was named a Living Historic Landmark. Weston State Hospital closed in May 1994, replaced by the $27 million, I can't talk, William R. Sharp Jr. Hospital in Weston. The Weston State Hospital building, now privately owned, is operated as a tourist attraction under its original name, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. I'm going to do a whole episode on it. Maybe next month for Halloween month. I don't know. I'm still working on the schedule for that. But I'll definitely do a standalone episode sometime. So, because there's a lot more stuff going on there. But these are the 4 hospitals that Freeman went to. And then, like I said, I read he did 5 lobotomies at the Barboursville Hospital. But that's the only thing I could even find about the Barboursville Hospital. So, I'm not sure what kind of hospital it was. I know they have a big veterans home there. So maybe it was part of that. I'm not really sure. But in the summer of 1952, Freeman embarked on his most ambitious project. Over a period of 12 days, he operated on hundreds of patients in West Virginia psychiatric hospitals. His blitzkrieg of brain surgery became known as Operation Ice Pick in the media, named after the tools he wielded. Freeman performed 228 transorbital lobotomies in a 2-week period in West Virginia. 228 lobotomies in a 2-week period. That's just crazy. 103 were done at Weston, 56 were done at Spencer, 55 at Huntington, and 50 at Lakin. One account says Freeman devoted an intensity and an energy to his mission in West Virginia that surpassed anywhere else. Over the next 4 years, he frequently visited the state, with the results that its per capita rate of lobotomy was the highest in the nation. In the 1950s, Freeman operated on additional patients at West Virginia hospitals in Huntington, Lakin, and Spencer. At the hospital in Lakin, a segregated institution mostly for colored boys, it says, Freeman was pleased when he returned a week or so after operating on 20 very dangerous Negroes. This is what it says. I'm not saying that. And found 15 of them sitting under the trees with only one guard in sight. It was the first time that they had been out of the seclusion rooms from anywhere from 6 months to 7 years, the report said. Newsweek reported the operation had made the mental patients much easier to care for in the institutions, leading to discharging patients from a crowded situation. The New York Times reported that Dr. Freeman was on a crusade to teach his technique to doctors in America. In 1952, Time reported that ice-pick patients suffered from a variety of mental disorders, anxiety, neuroses, while others often fought against irrational fears, morbid thoughts, hallucinations. I can never say that word right. I say it wrong every time. Hallucinations and suicidal depression. It was an ongoing project over a couple of years. The total lobotomies done at West Virginia state facilities was 744. According to Dr. Freeman's, 260 of the patients were eventually able to be sent home. But it was not considered a success. The official state record says that only 30% of the patients were able to go home. 30% had no improvement in their condition. According to the state, only about 20% showed some improvement, but not enough to be discharged from the facilities. Although it wasn't the success that they were told it would be, they do think it could be considered somewhat of a success and not a total failure, which isn't great, but, no one wants to admit total failure, especially the government. But West Virginia did save thousands of patient days by the release of the 260 patients that were cured. Few of them ever had to return. And some of the patients who didn't have anywhere to live outside of the institution were able to offer limited care to some of the other patients. It said overall there were less than 30 deaths for the whole time. I feel like 30 deaths, though, out of 744 seems like a lot of deaths. But it says in the article I was reading that it was a low level, so I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but I feel like any death is too many, especially when most of the patients probably had little say in the choice of their treatment. Some psychiatrists said that although the lobotomies don't always remedy pain or alleviate self-destructive habits, that patient that had this done did tend to worry less about things and were less pain than before the procedure. Well, yeah, if it didn't work, it still probably made them more docile. After all, their brains had literally been scrambled. The procedure's effectiveness was doubtful, despite Freeman's claims to the contrary. Lobotomy was palliative, sometimes making otherwise controllable patients docile to the point that they could be released from the hospital, but with no corresponding blunting of volition, abstraction, and personality. The introduction of psychotropic medications in the mid-1950s, plus longitudinal studies disputing the claims of the operation's success, led the way to end the West Virginia Lobotomy Project in 1955. At least they finally saw the errors in their ways in West Virginia, but too little too late for many patients, unfortunately. After 4 decades, Freeman had personally performed possibly as many as 4,000 lobotomy surgeries in 23 states, of which 2,500 used his ice pick procedure, despite the fact that he had no formal surgical training. In February 1967, Freeman performed his final surgery on Helen Mortensen. Mortensen was a long-term patient and was receiving her 3rd lobotomy from Freeman. She died of a cerebral hemorrhage, as did many as many as 100 of his other patients. And he was finally banned from performing surgery. His patients often had to be retaught how to eat and use the bathroom. Relapses were common. Some never recovered, and about 15% died from the procedure. In 1951, one patient at Iowa's Cherokee Mental Health Institute died when Freeman suddenly stopped for a photo during the procedure, and the surgical instrument accidentally penetrated too far into the patient's brain, just so he could take a picture. It's ridiculous. Freeman usually wore neither gloves nor mask while doing the procedures. He lobotomized 19 minors, including a 4-year-old child. While most mental health specialists favored other therapies, by the 1960s, Freeman continued performing lobotomies until the 1967 one with Helen Mortensen. The hospital took his privileges away, and then he retired. Accounts indicate about 50,000 people had the surgery between the mid-1930s and 1970s. Before his death in 1972, he crossed and recrossed the nation 11 times, and had performed the ice pick lobotomy on no less than 2,500 patients in 23 states. Freeman died of complications arising from an operation for cancer on May 31st, 1972. So, was Walter Freeman a villain? A bad guy? I don't think he was exactly, but I don't think he was necessarily good either. Freeman was personally of the opinion that the treatment could stabilize the patient's personality and alleviate strong emotions. He saw psychosis as the result of excessive self-reflection, thoughts that kept worrying, he said, W-H-I-R-R-I-N-G, worrying back and forth in the brain. He envisaged that this never-ending circle of painful thoughts could be stopped by literally severing the fibers. Many of his patients he operated on stopped feeling anxious and appeared more childlike. It was later reported that many also become apathetic and passive, so that they lost all initiative in their ability to concentrate or produce an emotional response. So the question is, was this the preferred outcome? If so, it's not like he was trying to heal the patients, just trying to control them. And in that case, I don't feel like he was a good man. Thankfully, in the 1940s and 50s, there were strong dissenting voices against lobotomy as a treatment in the United States and elsewhere. The criticism was actually strongest in the Soviet Union, where a complete ban of lobotomies was introduced in 1950 on grounds that the treatment was inhumane. We often think of the Soviet Union was barbaric, and maybe they were in some ways, but in this instance, we were way worse. In the 1950s, psychiatry saw the introduction of neuroleptic drugs, and lobotomy was increasingly presented as an inhumane and oppressive treatment. As early as 1946, Robert Penn Warren published his Pulitzer Prize-winning novel All the King's Men, where lobotomy is portrayed as a barbaric treatment. The Journal of the Norwegian Medical Association was also quite critical of lobotomy and referred to the treatment in 1959 as an intervention that appeared to be random, indiscriminate, and lacking in neurophysiological and neuroanatomical insight. Man, that was hard to say. Today, the primary treatment for mental health conditions is medication psychotherapy. With the invention of neuroleptic drugs like Thorazine, They were much more effective and not invasive like lobotomies. These drugs, known as antipsychotics, were discovered in the late 1950s and were more effective in a lobotomy than treating mental health conditions. Thorazine was the first antipsychotic drug and was originally developed as a tranquilizer. It was discovered to be useful for treating psychosis by accident. Thankfully, the days of lobotomy is over, and hopefully we won't ever have to invent something quite as bad in the human brain as that. Yeah, so that was another heavy one. I mean, the dark side of Appalachia can be pretty dark. But I promise at least for the month of October will be more of a fun kind of scary and less reality kind of scary. As always, if you have any suggestions, hit me up. Follow me on social medias under Poisoned Appalachia. Email me at poisonappalachia@gmail.com. If you listen to my podcast, try to rate them if possible. It just helps, especially if you're on Spotify or Apple. And share, please. Please share as much as you can so we can get the word out. I appreciate you all. You all are awesome. And you're my favorite peeps. And next month is spooky time. So yay, Halloween. Bye-bye.